This video is brought to you by NordVPN. We're now just over 100 days into Javier Milei's premiership, and a lot has happened. Drastic cuts to public spending and a sharp currency devaluation have pushed Argentina's economy into an inflation-heavy recession. And while this was exactly what Milei predicted, he's now in a race against the clock to get Argentina's economy back on track before public patience wanes. So in this video, we're going to have a look at Argentina's economic turmoil, whether Milei's reforms are working, and why he's still surprisingly popular. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, as we see it, Milei had broadly three objectives going into his premiership. The first was a short-term economic goal, to reduce Argentina's fiscal and trade deficits, which mainly involved cutting government spending. The second was a longer-term economic goal, to, quote, dollarize the Argentinian economy in order to prevent future administrations from overspending or the central bank from printing silly amounts of money, as has happened in the past. The third and final objective was a political one, to remain sufficiently popular throughout all of this to actually get his reforms through. Because in Argentina, what often happens is that politicians come into office promising reform, but either get voted out of office or give up when their approval ratings start tanking. So, to evaluate his premiership so far, we're going to go through these objectives one by one and see how he's doing on each of them. Let's start with the first one, balancing the books. When he came to office, Milei had some pretty bold plans. He wanted to cut government spending by 40% and run a balanced primary budget in his first year by scrapping all electricity and gas subsidies, getting rid of 10 of Argentina's 18 government ministries, and privatizing all of Argentina's 34 state companies. So, how has this all been working out for him? Well, in certain respects, Milei has been more moderate than his campaign rhetoric suggested. Milei's first cabinet included a handful of establishment politicians, and his finance minister actually served under former President Mauricio Macri in the late 2010s, when he was responsible for borrowing a whole load of dollar-denominated debt, which is exactly what Milei doesn't want to do. Milei has also been unable to enact his most radical policies, because his two landmark bills, a series of presidential decrees known as the Urgent Necessity Decree and an economic reform package known as the Omnibus Bill, have been held up in Argentina's Congress and courts. Provincial governors have also resisted his reforms, which has restarted a long-standing debate within Argentina about the extent to which its politics should be federalized. His foreign policy has also been a bit more moderate than expected, especially with regards to China. During his campaign, he said he would cut trade ties with China because it was communist and, quote, an assassin. But in the past month, he's changed his tone, insisting that bilateral relations haven't changed, quote, one bit, and that if people want to do business with China, they can. This is almost definitely because he wants to preserve Argentina's swap line with China, which basically allows the Argentinian central bank to exchange pesos for yuan at a favourable rate, and provide an invaluable source of foreign currency. Nonetheless, despite legislative gridlock and hints of pragmatism, Milei has still introduced at least three pretty radical economic reforms. First, he significantly cut government spending, which has fallen by 12% year on year. He's achieved this via basically ditching price controls, cutting energy and transport subsidies, and refusing to uprate spending in certain departments with inflation. Second, he's devalued the peso by roughly 50% against the dollar, bringing it closer to the market exchange rate. For context, for most of modern history, Argentina has had basically two exchange rates, the official rate claimed by the government and the unofficial actual market rate, known as the blue rate. Before Milei took charge, for instance, the official rate was about 370 to the dollar, while the unofficial rate was about 1,000 to the dollar. Milei cut the official rate to 800 to the dollar, with plans to devalue it a further 2% every month until it matches the unofficial rate. While this triggered a spike in inflation, which reached a peak of 276% in February, in the long term it should eventually unify the currency and reduce imports, thereby improving Argentina's trade balance. Third, despite rising inflation, he's cut interest rates, both to encourage investment and also to reduce the amount of interest the central bank is currently paying on some of its debts, which should, paradoxically, end up reducing inflation by reducing the overall money supply. While these measures have caused some serious short-term economic pain, including a recession, sky-high inflation, and a 12% spike in relative poverty, this was inevitable, and there are signs of promise. Measured month on month, inflation has already started falling, and the government ran a budget surplus in both January and February, the first in over a decade. Argentina's borrowing costs have started falling, reflecting growing confidence amongst international investors, and Argentina's foreign exchange reserves have grown by $7 billion since Milei took over. So let's move on to his second objective, dollarization. Dollarization basically involves doing two things. First, you have to redenominate your peso debts into dollars, and second, you have to buy back all those pesos in circulation with dollars, or at least enough of them to deter a bank run. This means you need a lot of dollars in the first place, roughly 50 billion in Argentina's case, which the state really doesn't have at the moment. This is why dollarization was never going to happen in the short term, and Milei has since started talking about currency competition instead, which would involve allowing transactions in both dollars and pesos. Ultimately, dollarization looks unlikely to happen anytime soon, and will probably come after Milei's other reforms, if he ever gets them through Congress. Finally, let's have a look at his third objective, staying popular. Polling at the moment suggests that Milei's popularity has held up remarkably well, and he currently enjoys an approval rating of about 50%. Milei has been able to protect his popularity by blaming any and all of his shortcomings on Argentina's political establishment, which he calls the caste. To be fair, Argentina's establishment have done a remarkably terrible job of running its economy, and Argentina's Congress, which is currently dominated by more establishment parties, are indeed resisting Milei's more radical reforms. Nonetheless, blaming everything on the caste has its risks, because it makes Congress less likely to compromise, and at a certain point the electorate will demand he takes responsibility for things. This presents Milei with a bit of a dilemma going forward. Either he can refuse to compromise and continue to rail against the caste, in the hope that the electorate will buy it and reward him with a congressional majority at the midterm elections next year, or he can compromise to get at least some of his reforms through, but risk undermining his status as a radical outsider. Nonetheless, all in all, it's been a pretty good few months for Milei, and Argentina's economy looks like it might finally be tending towards normality. Now, watching our videos, it's understandable if, at times, you feel like the world isn't terribly safe. And unfortunately, this can be the case online too. You might try your best to keep everything secure, maybe you try to rotate through favourite passwords online, but that's not always enough to keep you safe. In fact, the most common form of account hacking these days is called credential stuffing. Essentially, you use one of your normal passwords on a website that's poorly maintained, and then if it gets compromised, you could find that information landing on the dark web. Hackers then just attempt the same email and password combinations on your social network account, streaming services, banks, you get the point. Luckily for you, NordVPN has a whole bunch of tools that can keep you safe online. With their suite of threat protection tools, including a dark web monitor, which notifies you if someone leaks your credentials. It's not just that though, their threat protection can also warn you about phishing links and block malicious ads before you even see them. It really is all-round protection for your digital life. And if you sign up for a 2-year plan using our link, you'll not only get a massive discount, but you also get 4 extra months totally free. So if you want to support the channel and improve our journalism, then make sure that you use the link in the description so that they know that you came from us.